"Go eat outside, on the street, you beggar!" my son Richard screamed when I tried to sit down at the table in the restaurant. I took a deep breath, motioned to the waiter, and replied calmly, "All right, but in that case, you're the ones who will have to leave." The words came out of my mouth with a calmness that even I didn't expect. All the diners at the Gilded Scepter restaurant turned to look at us. Richard was frozen, his face red with shame. His wife, Jessica, dropped her wine glass on the white tablecloth. What my son didn't know was who I really am. My name is Susan. I am 65 years old, and that night, everything was going to change forever. But let me tell you how I got to that moment. Because what happened after my words was something that no one, absolutely no one, expected. It all began 3 hours earlier, when Richard called me on the phone. "Mom, I want to take you to dinner at the best restaurant in the city. I have something to celebrate, and I want you to be there." His voice sounded different, almost mocking. But I, as always, wanted to believe that my son was finally including me in his successful life. I got ready with such care that night. I put on my best dress, an emerald green one I had bought years ago but rarely wore. I did my hair meticulously, put on a little makeup, and even wore the pearl earrings that had belonged to my mother. I wanted to look presentable for my successful son. Richard had done very well for himself in recent years. He was a regional manager for a major company, had a large house in the most exclusive neighborhood, and his wife, Jessica, always wore expensive clothes. But with me, his own mother, he was increasingly cold and distant. I arrived at the Gilded Scepter restaurant at exactly 8 o'clock in the evening. It was an elegant place, with white tablecloths, crystal glasses, and waiters dressed in tuxedos. The kind of place where a single dinner costs more than $200 per person, a place I knew very well, although Richard had no idea. When I asked for Richard Garcia's table, the maître d'arthur looked me up and down. My green dress, though my best, looked modest compared to the elegant outfits of the other women dining there. "Of course, ma'am." "Follow me, please," he said with a professional smile. I walked behind him between the tables, feeling all the curious eyes on me. Some people whispered to each other, probably wondering what a woman like me was doing in such an exclusive place. Richard was already sitting at a table in the center, next to Jessica. She was wearing a very expensive red dress and jewelry that sparkled under the restaurant lights. As I got closer, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was no chair for me. "Hello, son," I said with a forced smile, expecting him to get up to give me a hug or at least to explain where I was going to sit. Richard looked at me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ah, Mom, you're here." He didn't get up. He didn't greet me warmly. Jessica didn't even look up from her plate. "And my chair?" I asked, feeling increasingly uncomfortable. "Your chair?" Richard started to laugh. But it wasn't a happy laugh. It was cruel, merciless. "Mom, I didn't invite you to dinner. I told you to come so you could see how successful people live, so you can understand the difference between you and us." I felt as if I had been punched in the stomach. People at the nearby tables started paying more attention to us. "Son, I don't understand," I murmured, trying to maintain my dignity. "You don't understand?" Richard raised his voice. "Mom, look at yourself. Look at this place. Do you really think you belong here? We come to this restaurant every week. We spend more on one dinner than you spend in a whole month." Jessica finally spoke, without looking up from her food. "Richard, don't be so hard on her. It's not your mother's fault she's, well, the way she is." Those words hurt more than my own son's. The humiliation was so intense that I felt tears welling up in my eyes, but there was something they didn't know. Something I had kept secret for all these years. And that night, that secret was about to come out in the most spectacular way possible. "Richard, please," I whispered, trying to control the tremor in my voice. "I just wanted to spend some time with you. We haven't talked like mother and son for months." My son leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms as if he were enjoying my discomfort. "Talk? What are we going to talk about, Mom? Your boring life? How you spend your days watching soap operas in your little apartment?" The people at the nearby tables were no longer hiding the fact that they were listening to our conversation. An elegant couple at the next table exchanged pitying glances in my direction. I felt the heat rise in my neck, but something inside me told me to stay calm. "Son, I work hard. I've always worked hard to get by," I replied, trying to hold on to my dignity. "I don't have much money, it's true, but I have my pride." Jessica let out a dismissive little laugh. "Pride? Susan, forgive me, but what can you possibly be proud of? You live in a 2-room apartment, you take the bus everywhere, and you buy your clothes at discount stores." Every word was like a stab, but what hurt the most was seeing the satisfied smile on my son's face. How had he become this cruel person? Where was the sweet boy I had raised with so much love? "Mom," Richard continued, raising his voice so more people could hear, "the truth is, I'm embarrassed to introduce you as my mother. Look at Jessica. Look at how she dresses, how she talks, how she carries herself. That's the kind of woman who belongs with someone like me." Jessica smiled, pleased, and adjusted her dyed blonde hair. Her red dress must have cost more than $1,000, and her shoes were from an Italian brand I knew very well. All too well. "Jessica comes from an important family," Richard went on. "Her father owns 3 car dealerships. She went to a private university, speaks 3 languages, and understands business. And you? What can you teach me? How to survive on $200 a week?" The tears threatened to spill from my eyes, but I held them back. There was something Richard didn't know. Something Jessica didn't know either. Something that no one in my family knew, and that tonight was about to change their lives forever. The waiter, Arthur, discreetly approached our table. I had known him for years, though he couldn't say anything at that moment. He looked at me with a concerned expression in his eyes. "Would you like to order anything else?" he asked politely. "No, thank you," Richard replied curtly. "My mother won't be having dinner with us. In fact, I think it's time for her to leave." "But son," I murmured, "I thought you said you wanted to celebrate something with me." Richard laughed again. "Celebrate with you? Mom, what I want to celebrate is my promotion, my new position, my successful life. Do you think I want to celebrate that with someone who reminds me of where I came from? Jessica and I belong to a different social level than you." "Richard is right," Jessica added, taking a sip of her wine, which cost $100 a bottle. "We frequent places like this because we can afford it. We have the money, the education, and the social class to be here. It's nothing personal against you, Susan, but there are differences that can't be ignored." I looked around the restaurant. It was truly beautiful. The crystal chandeliers shone softly, the paintings on the walls were original works of art, and the piano music created a perfect atmosphere. Every detail had been carefully selected to create the most elegant experience possible. "This restaurant is really beautiful," I commented in a low voice. "Of course it's beautiful," Richard replied arrogantly. "It's the most expensive in the entire city. The waiting list to get a table here is 3 months. But when you have money and connections, like us, doors open." Jessica nodded. "We know the manager, the chef, and even the owner." "Well, Richard knows the owner personally," she added. "That's why we always get the best table." A small smile appeared on my lips. If only she knew the truth about who really knew the owner of this restaurant. "Mom, why are you smiling like that?" Richard looked at me suspiciously. "Do you find it funny that I'm explaining how the real world works?" "No, son," I replied calmly. "I was just thinking about something." "About what?" "That you're right about one thing. There are indeed differences that can't be ignored. Differences that you don't know about, but that tonight will become very clear." Richard and Jessica exchanged a confused look. The tone of my voice had changed. It no longer sounded like the humble, submissive mother they knew. "What are you talking about?" Jessica asked with some unease. Before I could answer, another waiter approached the table. It was Oscar, the restaurant manager, a distinguished man in his 50s with an impeccable suit and refined manners. "Good evening," he greeted politely. "Is everything all right at your table?" Richard sat up straighter in his chair, obviously pleased to receive the manager's attention. "Everything is perfect, Oscar. As always, the service is exceptional." Oscar smiled professionally, but when his eyes met mine, I noticed a small flicker of recognition. He knew who I was. Of course he knew. "I'm glad to hear that," Oscar replied. Then he looked directly at me. "Ma'am, are you enjoying your visit tonight?" The question seemed innocent, but there was something more behind it. Richard didn't notice, but I did. Oscar was waiting for my signal. "Oscar," I said in a firm voice, "I think it's time for you to speak with the owner. There is a situation here that requires his immediate attention." Oscar nodded slowly, as if he had been expecting those words all night. "Of course, ma'am. The owner will be here in a moment." Richard frowned, clearly confused by the exchange. "The owner? What are you talking about? Mom, do you know the manager of this place?" Jessica also seemed bewildered. "Susan, how do you know Oscar?" I smiled but didn't answer. I just waited. The next few minutes would be the most important of my life, and definitely the most shocking for my son. Meanwhile, Richard turned to Oscar with his typical arrogance. "Hey, Oscar, I don't know what's going on here, but my mother is a bit confused lately. Sometimes she says things that don't make sense. Her age, you know." Oscar maintained his professional smile, but said nothing. His silence only increased the tension at the table. "Why aren't you answering?" Richard insisted. "Do you really know my mother?" "Young Mr. Garcia," Oscar replied carefully, "I think it's best if we wait for the owner. He will be able to clear up all your doubts." Jessica leaned closer to Richard and whispered, "This is very strange. Your mother is acting bizarrely. Do you think she's all there?" Her words were just loud enough for me to hear, but instead of hurting me, they gave me more strength, because I knew that in a few minutes, she would eat every one of those words. The people at the nearby tables had noticed the tension. Some diners had stopped eating to discreetly watch what was happening. The murmur of conversations had subsided, as if the entire restaurant was holding its breath. Richard began to get impatient. "Mom, this is ridiculous. I don't know what game you're playing, but it's over. Jessica and I want to enjoy our dinner in peace." "In peace?" I repeated, my voice growing firmer. "Like the peace you've given me all these years? Like the peace of being treated like a stranger by my own son?" "Enough," Richard shouted, slamming his hand on the table. The glasses trembled, and several people turned completely towards us. "You're making a scene. You're embarrassing me in front of all these important people." Jessica put her hand on Richard's arm. "Calm down, honey. People are staring." "Exactly." Richard stood up, his face red with anger. "Mom, I'm going to ask you to leave right now. You're ruining my night, my celebration, my reputation." I remained seated, completely calm. "Your reputation? The reputation of someone who treats his own mother like trash?" "You're not trash," Richard yelled, but his tone said otherwise. You're just different from us. You belong to another world. A world of ordinary people, of people without ambition, of people who settle for little." The words echoed throughout the restaurant. An uncomfortable silence fell over the place. Even the waiters had stopped their activities to watch the scene. Jessica stood up as well. "Susan, please. Richard is right. This isn't your place. Look around you. Look at how other people see you. They're looking at you with pity." She was right about one thing. People were looking at me. But not with pity. There was something else in their expressions. Curiosity, expectation, as if they knew something important was about to happen. "Do you know how much this dinner costs, Mom?" Richard continued, pointing at the table. $300. Just for what we've had so far. That's more than you spend on food in an entire month. "And do you know how much the wine you're drinking costs?" I added calmly. $250 a bottle. Dom Perignon 2015. An excellent choice. Richard looked at me, surprised. "How do you know that?" "Because I know this place well, son. Very well." Jessica laughed. "You know this place well? Since when? From looking at the menu from the outside?" Her comment drew a few nervous chuckles from the nearby tables. But I was unfazed. At that moment, a familiar figure appeared, walking towards our table. It was a distinguished man in his 60s, with a perfectly tailored gray suit and a presence that commanded immediate respect. Oscar followed closely behind him. Richard recognized him immediately. "Mr. Gregory," he exclaimed with a servile smile. "What an honor to see you here. I'm Richard Garcia. I believe we met briefly at the business conference last month." Gregory nodded politely. "Yes, I vaguely remember." But his eyes were fixed on me. "Good evening, Susan." The way he said my name made Richard freeze. It wasn't the greeting of a successful businessman to an ordinary old woman. It was the greeting of someone who knew me well. "Good evening, Gregory," I replied naturally. "I'm so sorry you have to come down here for this matter." Jessica looked at Richard, completely confused. "How does your mother know Mr. Gregory?" Richard stammered. I don't know. Mom, how do you know Mr. Gregory?" Gregory approached the table, and his presence made all the nearby diners fall completely silent. "Mrs. Garcia," he said to me formally, "is there a problem I need to resolve?" The formal way he addressed me as Mrs. Garcia made Richard frown even more. Why would such an important man speak to me with so much respect? "Yes, there is a problem," I replied clearly. "My son and his wife have gravely disrespected me. They have publicly humiliated me in this restaurant, told me I don't belong here, and asked me to leave." Gregory nodded seriously. "I understand. And what would you like me to do about it?" Richard interrupted desperately. "Wait. Mr. Gregory, there's a misunderstanding. My mother is exaggerating. I was just explaining to her that this place is a bit sophisticated for her." Gregory turned to Richard with a cold expression. "Sophisticated for her? Are you telling your mother she has no right to be in this restaurant?" "That's not it," Richard protested. "It's just, well, she can't afford a dinner here. She lives on $200 a week. This isn't within her means." Jessica nodded vigorously. "Exactly. We weren't being cruel, just realistic. This place costs a fortune." Gregory looked at me again. "Is that true, Susan? You can't afford to dine here?" A slow smile spread across my face. It was the moment I had been waiting for years. The moment my son would discover who his mother really was. "Well, Gregory," I said, rising from my chair, "that depends on how you look at it." I took an envelope from my purse that I had been carrying with me for months, waiting for the perfect moment to use it. I placed it on the table, right in front of Richard. "What is that?" Jessica asked suspiciously. "Open it," I told Richard. "Open it and read what it says." Richard took the envelope with trembling hands. Jessica leaned in to get a better look. When Richard pulled out the documents and began to read, his face turned as pale as wax. "No, it can't be," he murmured. "What does it say?" Jessica asked anxiously, trying to see the documents over Richard's shoulder. "What can't be?" Richard read aloud, his voice shaking. "Certificate of ownership. The Gilded Scepter Restaurant. Owner, Susan Garcia." His voice faded to a whisper. Date of acquisition: March 15th, 2018. The silence that followed was deafening. The people at the nearby tables had completely stopped pretending they weren't listening. Some had even stood up slightly from their seats to get a better view of what was happening. Jessica snatched the papers from Richard's hands. "This has to be fake. It has to be a joke." "Susan, these documents are fake." Gregory cleared his throat. "Mrs. Garcia, I assure you those documents are completely authentic. Mrs. Susan Garcia is indeed the owner of this restaurant, and also of 4 other restaurants in the city." "4 other restaurants?" Richard exclaimed, still in shock. "Mom, this is impossible. You live in a small apartment, you take the bus, you shop at discount stores." I sat down again, feeling more powerful than I had in years. "It's true, son. I live simply because I choose to, but that doesn't mean I don't have money." "How much money?" Jessica asked, her voice barely audible. Gregory answered for me. "Mrs. Garcia has a net worth of approximately $8 million. Her restaurants generate annual profits of nearly $2 million. Richard sank into his chair as if he'd been physically struck. $8 million? "Why?" Jessica murmured. "Why did you never tell us anything?" I leaned back in my chair, observing the shocked and confused faces of my son and his wife, because I wanted to know the true character of the people around me. I wanted to know if you would love me for who I am, not for what I have. "But Mom," Richard stammered, "I'm your son. How could you hide something like this from me?" "How could I hide it from you?" I repeated, my voice filling with an anger I had suppressed for years. "Are you seriously asking me that after everything I've heard tonight?" I stood up again, and this time my posture was completely different. I was no longer the humble, submissive old woman. I was a successful businesswoman, a millionaire who had built an empire from scratch. "Richard, for the last 5 years, ever since you started to succeed in your job, you have treated me like a burden. You have made me feel ashamed of my appearance, of the way I dress, of the way I live." People at the nearby tables started murmuring among themselves. Some discreetly took out their phones, probably to record what was happening. "Remember last Christmas?" I continued. "When you told me it was better if I didn't come to your party because I wouldn't fit in with your important guests?" Richard shrank in his seat. "Mom, or Jessica's birthday 6 months ago? When you told me there was a dress code and that my clothes weren't appropriate for the event?" Jessica avoided my gaze, clearly uncomfortable. "All this time," I went on, "you have assumed that I am poor, that I am a burden, that I am someone to be ashamed of. And tonight, you confirmed exactly what I suspected about you." Oscar discreetly approached and whispered in my ear, "Mrs. Garcia, would you like us to ask them to leave the restaurant?" Before I could answer, Richard stood up abruptly. "Wait. Mom, if you have so much money, why do you live the way you do? Why didn't you tell me anything? We're family." "Family?" I laughed, but it wasn't a happy laugh. "Family? Richard, 15 minutes ago you yelled at me to go eat on the street like a beggar. Is that what family does?" Jessica tried to intervene. "Susan, if we had known—" "If you had known what?" I interrupted her. "If you had known I had money, you would have treated me with respect? Is that your definition of family love? Conditional respect based on financial status?" A murmur of approval was heard from the nearby tables. Clearly, the other diners were enjoying the spectacle, and many seemed to be on my side. "Mom, please," Richard pleaded. "We can talk about this at home, in private." "In private?" I pointed around the restaurant. "Like when you humiliated me in public a few minutes ago? Like when you told all these witnesses that I don't belong here?" Gregory stepped closer to me. "Mrs. Garcia, as the general manager of your properties, I must ask, do you wish for us to take any specific action?" Richard turned to Gregory in desperation. "Mr. Gregory, please. She's my mother. There must be some way to resolve this." "Young man," Gregory replied coldly, "you have just spent the last 30 minutes insulting and humiliating the owner of this establishment. Not only that, but you did it in front of dozens of witnesses." Jessica started to cry. "We didn't know. If we had known she was the owner, we never would have." "Never would have what?" I interrupted her. "Never would have disrespected me? Do you only respect rich people? What kind of values are those?" An elegant man at a nearby table began to applaud slowly. Soon, other people joined in. It wasn't mocking applause, but one of admiration. They were applauding my stance, my dignity, my handling of the situation. Richard looked around, noticing for the first time that the entire restaurant's attention was on us. "Mom, people are staring at us." "Yes, they are staring at us," I confirmed. "They are seeing exactly the kind of person you really are. They are seeing how you treat your own mother when you think she has nothing to offer you." "But now I know you have money," Richard said desperately. "Now we know the truth. We can start over." "Start over?" I laughed bitterly. "Now that you know I have money, you want to start over? Now I'm good enough to be your mother?" Jessica wiped her tears and tried to take my hand. "Susan, please, forgive us. We didn't know." I pulled my hand away sharply. "Jessica, an hour ago you told me that Richard was ashamed to introduce me as his mother. You told me I didn't have the education, the social class, or the money to be here. Do you remember?" She nodded miserably. "Well, you were right about one thing. There are indeed differences between us that can't be ignored, but they are not the differences you thought they were." I walked towards the center of the restaurant, where everyone could see and hear me clearly. My voice rose with an authority I had never before shown in front of my son. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, addressing the entire restaurant, "I am very sorry for the interruption to your dinner, but I think it's important that you, as witnesses to what has just happened here, know the whole story." An absolute silence fell over the place. Even the waiters stopped to listen. Richard tried to stand up to stop me, but Gregory placed a firm hand on his shoulder, forcing him to stay seated. "My name is Susan Garcia, and I am the owner of this restaurant," I continued. "For the last 7 years, I have come here regularly, but always discreetly, observing how my business operates, getting to know my employees, making sure my customers receive the best possible service." Some diners nodded, and I noticed that several recognized me now. The elderly woman who sometimes sat alone at the corner table, who always ordered the same thing and left generous tips. But tonight, I went on. I was invited here by my own son, who publicly humiliated me, insulted me, and asked me to leave because, according to him, I do not belong in this place. A murmur of disapproval was heard throughout the restaurant. The expressions on people's faces showed a mixture of shock, indignation, and pity. Richard stood up abruptly. "Mom, stop. Don't do this. You're ruining my reputation." "Your reputation?" I turned to him with a cold smile. "Richard, you ruined your own reputation the moment you decided to treat your mother like trash in front of all these people." Jessica tried one last time to save herself. "Susan, please, understand our position. We had no way of knowing that." "That I had money?" I cut her off. "Is that really your excuse? That you didn't know I had money? That's why it was okay to disrespect me?" An elegant woman at a nearby table spoke up loudly. "Exactly. Respect doesn't depend on how much money someone has. It's a matter of basic decency." Other voices joined in agreement. The atmosphere of the restaurant had completely changed. It was no longer an elegant, quiet dinner. It had become the stage for a public lesson on dignity and family respect. I turned back to Richard and Jessica. "But now that you know the truth, let me explain exactly how things are going to change." Richard looked desperate. "Mom, please, we can talk about this in private. Not here, not in front of all these people." "Why not here?" I replied firmly. "You had no problem humiliating me here in front of all these people. So right here is where you're going to listen to what I have to say." Oscar approached and offered me a chair in the center, as if it were a stage. I sat down elegantly, feeling for the first time in years the power and respect I deserved. "Richard," I began, "for the past 5 years, ever since you started earning a good salary, you have changed completely. You've become arrogant, dismissive, and you've forgotten where you come from." "Mom, Don't interrupt me." My voice echoed through the restaurant. "Now you are going to listen. You are going to listen to everything I have to say." Richard sank into his chair, clearly defeated. "Do you remember when you were 12 and you got pneumonia?" I continued. "Do you remember that we didn't have health insurance, and I worked 3 jobs for 2 months to pay for your treatment?" My voice broke slightly as I recalled those difficult times. "I worked during the day in an office, at night cleaning buildings, and on weekends in a restaurant. I slept 3 hours a night to make sure you had everything you needed." The people in the restaurant listened in complete silence. Some older women had tears in their eyes. "And do you know why I did all that?" I asked, looking directly at Richard. "Because I loved you. Because you were my son. Not because you had money, not because you could give me something in return, but because a mother's love is unconditional." Jessica began to cry again, but these were no longer tears of self-pity. She seemed to finally understand the magnitude of what they had done. "But you, Richard," I continued, "your love for me turned out to be completely conditional. You love me only when it's convenient, only when I don't embarrass you, only when I fit into your image of success." An older man at a table in the back shouted, "That's how you tell them, ma'am. Tell them their truths." The public approval gave me even more strength. "Now let me tell you how I got my money, because it's important that you understand it wasn't through luck or inheritance." Richard looked up, clearly curious despite his humiliation. "After your father died when you were 15, I explained, I was left alone with a huge debt and a son to support. But instead of sinking into self-pity, I decided to fight. I stood up again, walking slowly around the table as I spoke. I started by working as a waitress in a small restaurant, but I didn't settle for that. I watched, I learned, I studied every aspect of the business. How the kitchen worked, how the finances were managed, how to treat customers. The silence in the restaurant was total. Even the staff had stopped working to listen to my story. After 5 years, when I had enough experience and savings, I took out a loan and bought my first small restaurant. It was a modest place, in a humble neighborhood, but I turned it into a success." Jessica whispered, "That's why you know so much about restaurants." "Exactly," I replied, "because I built this empire from scratch, with my own hands, with my own effort. Every restaurant I bought after that was because I had proven that I could make a business work." Richard finally spoke, his voice broken. "Mom, I didn't know any of this." "You didn't know because you never asked," I snapped. "You were never interested in my life. You only cared that I didn't embarrass you in front of your successful friends." Gregory approached again. "Mrs. Garcia, would you like us to proceed?" "Proceed with what?" Richard asked in a panic. I turned to him with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "The expulsion procedure. As the owner of this establishment, I have the right to deny entry to any person who causes a disturbance or disrespects other customers." "You can't do that," Jessica cried. "We're family." "Family?" I laughed. "An hour ago, you told me I wasn't good enough to be part of your family. Now that you know I have money, suddenly we're family again?" Spontaneous applause erupted from several tables. The diners were clearly enjoying seeing justice unfold. Richard stood up desperately. "Mom, please, forgive me. Forgive us. We can change. We can be better." "You can change?" I repeated. "You can be better?" "Richard, the problem isn't that you can change. The problem is that you only want to change now that you know I have money." I approached him, looking him directly in the eyes. "Tell me one thing, son. If right now I told you that I don't actually have any money, that this has all been a joke, how would you treat me? Would you go back to asking me to leave the restaurant?" Richard opened his mouth to answer, but no words came out. The answer was clear in his silence. Richard's silence was more eloquent than any words. In that moment, both he and Jessica understood that they had been completely unmasked, not just in front of me, but in front of the entire restaurant full of witnesses. "Your silence says it all, son," I murmured, feeling a mix of sadness and relief. "After all, you know me better than I thought." Jessica tried one last desperate strategy. "Susan, we can really change. Richard has been under a lot of pressure at work lately. He hasn't been himself." I turned to her with a cold look. "Pressure at work? Is that your excuse for mistreating an elderly woman? For humiliating your husband's mother?" A businessman at a nearby table stood up. "Ma'am, with all due respect, I know Richard from work, and I can confirm that he talks about you in exactly the way he has treated you tonight. He always refers to you as my poor mother, or the burden I have to support." Richard turned pale as death. "Mr. Martinez, I never." That was taken out of context. "Taken out of context?" Mr. Martinez laughed. "Richard, last month, during the executive meeting, you said, and I quote, 'My mother is a simple woman who doesn't understand my standard of living. Sometimes it's embarrassing to have to explain why she can't accompany me to important social events.'" A murmur of outrage was heard throughout the restaurant. Richard tried to deny it, but the damage was already done. "You see, Richard," I said in a calm voice, "this isn't just about tonight. It's about how you really think of me. It's about the shame you feel for your own mother." I addressed the entire restaurant again. "Ladies and gentlemen, for years I have watched my son become a person I don't recognize, a person who values appearances more than feelings, a person who is ashamed of his roots." I walked slowly to the large restaurant window, from where the entire illuminated city could be seen. "You see that city out there? I started from the bottom, in the humblest neighborhoods. I worked washing dishes, cleaning tables, serving people who sometimes treated me poorly, but I never lost my dignity." I turned to Richard, who had his head down, completely defeated. "Yet my own son, my own blood, has made me feel more humiliated in these last few years than any stranger ever has." Jessica began to cry harder. "Susan, please, give us a chance. We can go to family therapy. We can fix this." "Family therapy?" I laughed bitterly. "Jessica, do you really think this can be fixed with therapy? Do you think you can cure years of contempt and humiliation with a few sessions?" Oscar approached discreetly. "Mrs. Garcia, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there are several reporters outside. It seems someone has leaked the story on social media. Do you want me to keep them away?" Richard stood up abruptly. "Reporters?" "Mom, this is going to ruin my career. My boss is going to find out. Everyone in my company will know what happened." "Now you're worried about your career?" I replied firmly. "You weren't worried when you were screaming at me in front of the whole restaurant?" "It's different," Richard yelled desperately. "This was a private family conversation." "Private?" I pointed around the crowded restaurant. You scream at your mother in a public restaurant and you call it a private conversation? Mr. Martinez intervened again. Richard, I'm sorry to tell you, but several employees from our company are dining here tonight. The story has already reached the office. Your behavior will be reviewed by Human Resources. Richard fell back into his chair, as if he had been physically struck. No, it can't be. My career, my reputation. Your reputation, I repeated slowly, was ruined by you the moment you decided it was acceptable to treat your mother like trash. Jessica tried to take Richard's hand, but he pushed it away brusquely. This is all your fault, he yelled at her. You were the one who convinced me my mother was a burden. You were the one who told me to be ashamed of her. My fault? Jessica stood up, indignant. You were the one constantly complaining about her. I was just supporting you. And there it was, the truth finally coming out. Not only had they humiliated me tonight, but they had been bad-mouthing me for years, feeding each other's contempt for me. Enough, I said in a firm voice. Enough blaming each other. You are both equally responsible. I turned to Gregory. Please, bring the documents. What documents? Richard asked, his voice filled with terror. Gregory disappeared for a few minutes and returned with a thick folder. He opened it on the table and took out several papers. These, I said solemnly, are the documents that confirm I am the owner not only of this restaurant, but of a chain of 5 restaurants throughout the city. Jessica looked at the papers with wide eyes. 5 restaurants? Yes, 5 restaurants, including the Secret Garden, where you celebrated your anniversary last year, including Ocean View, where Richard took his important clients last month, including the Gilded Terrace, where Jessica celebrated her birthday. Richard looked up sharply. You own all those places? That's right. And every time you have gone to those restaurants, bragging about your success, your money, your social status, you have been spending money in businesses that belong to me. The irony of the situation was not lost on anyone. Several diners began to laugh softly, enjoying the poetic justice of the moment. But there's more, I continued, taking another document from the folder. This is my current will. The silence that followed was absolute. You could hear a fork drop on the farthest tables. In this will, I said clearly, I left my entire fortune to my only son, Richard Garcia. $8 million, 5 restaurants, and several real estate properties. Richard's eyes widened. Left? Why do you say left? I smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who had finally found justice. Because after tonight, after what you have shown yourself to be, that will is going to change. No, Richard shouted, standing up so abruptly that his chair fell backward. Mom, please! I'm your only son. I'm your family. My family? I laughed. Richard, an hour ago you told me to go eat on the street like a beggar. That's how you treat your family. Jessica stood up too, panic in her eyes. Susan, please, think about it. Richard made a mistake, but he's still your son. Blood is more important than anything. Blood is more important than anything, I repeated. Then why has my own blood treated me worse than any stranger? I turned to the whole restaurant. Ladies and gentlemen, you have been witnesses to everything that has happened here tonight. You have seen how my son has treated me, how he has humiliated me, how he has been ashamed of me. The diners nodded, many with expressions of approval for my stance. Well then, I continued, you will also be witnesses to the consequences. I took my cell phone out of my purse and dialed a number Richard didn't recognize. Good evening, Mr. Arthur Lewis? Yes, this is Susan Garcia. I need you to come immediately to the Gilded Scepter restaurant with the documents we prepared last week. Yes, it's urgent. The new will. Richard froze. New will? You already prepared a new will? I ended the call and looked him straight in the eye. Richard, did you really think this was the first time you humiliated me? Did you think I hadn't noticed how you've treated me all these years? Jessica intervened desperately. But, Susan, don't you think you're being too drastic? He's your only son. Drastic? I turned to her with contained fury. Jessica, for the last 5 years, your husband has systematically excluded me from his life. He has made me feel like a stranger in my own family. I walked to the center of the restaurant, where everyone could hear me clearly. My voice rose with an authority that surprised even myself. Do you want to know why I decided to live simply despite having money? I asked the entire restaurant. Because I wanted to test something. I wanted to see if the people who claimed to love me really did so for who I am, not for what I have. A murmur of understanding spread through the tables. People were beginning to understand the depth of my social experiment. For 7 years, I continued, I have lived in a modest apartment, worn simple clothes, taken the bus, and acted as if I were an ordinary retiree. And do you know what I discovered? Richard looked at me with growing terror, as if finally understanding the magnitude of what he had done. I discovered that my own son was ashamed of me. I discovered that he saw me as a burden. I discovered that he would rather exclude me from his life than explain to his rich friends that he had a poor mother. Tears began to form in my eyes, but my voice remained steady. Do you know what it feels like for your own son to ask you not to come to his wedding because you don't fit the level of the event? A choked gasp was heard from several tables. Some older women had their hands over their hearts, clearly moved by my words. Richard turned pale. Mom, I never said that exactly. Didn't you? I took out my phone and searched through my messages. Here is your text message from April 15th, 2023. Mom, Jessica and I have decided to have a small wedding, just close family and important friends. I think it would be better if you didn't come. The venue is very elegant, and I don't want you to feel uncomfortable. I read the message aloud so the whole restaurant could hear. The reaction was immediate. Murmurs of indignation, some applause of support for me, and shocked expressions on the faces of the diners. That message doesn't say you can't come, Richard protested desperately. Doesn't it? I continued reading. Besides, most of the guests are colleagues from my work and important clients. I need to maintain a certain professional image. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Jessica looked ashamed. Maintain a certain professional image, I repeated slowly. Translated, your mother would ruin your professional image. An older man at a table in the back stood up. Ma'am, my mother was right when she said that ungrateful children are the worst misfortune a woman can have. Several diners applauded his comment. The atmosphere of the restaurant had completely changed. It was no longer just a spectacle. It had become a public trial on family values. Richard looked around the restaurant, noticing for the first time that all the attention was truly on us. Mom, please, let's go home. We can talk about this in private. Home? I laughed bitterly. To which home, Richard? To my modest apartment that embarrasses you so much? Or to your big house in the exclusive neighborhood where I've never been welcome? Jessica tried to intervene. Susan, you've always been welcome in our home. Welcome? I took out my phone again. Let me read you some of the messages Jessica has sent me over the past 2 years. Jessica turned pale. No, please. Message from December 8th, 2024. I read aloud. Susan, Richard and I are having a Christmas dinner with our friends. I think it would be better if you came another day, when we can dedicate more time to you. I continued reading. Message from March 22nd, 2024. Susan, this weekend we have important guests. Could you come visit us during the week, when it's quieter? Each message I read generated more murmurs of disapproval from the nearby tables. Do you see the pattern? I asked the restaurant. There was always an excuse. There was always a reason why I couldn't be present when there were. Important people. Richard slumped in his chair, completely defeated. Mom, we thought you preferred. That I preferred what? I interrupted him. That I preferred to be alone? That I preferred to be excluded from the life of my only son? At that moment, the restaurant door opened, and a distinguished man in his 60s entered, carrying a leather briefcase. It was Mr. Arthur Lewis, my lawyer. Good evening, Mrs. Garcia, he greeted formally. I brought the documents you requested. Richard stood up abruptly. What documents? Mom, please, don't do anything you might regret. Regret? I turned to him with a cold smile. Richard, the only thing I regret is not having done this sooner. Mr. Lewis opened his briefcase and took out several documents. Mrs. Garcia, here is the new will we prepared last week. as well as the property transfer documents we discussed. Property transfer? Jessica asked, her voice breaking. Yes, I replied calmly. I have decided to leave my fortune to charitable organizations that help elderly people abandoned by their families, and also to loyal employees who have shown me more respect and affection than my own blood. Arthur, the waiter who had served us all night, approached timidly. Mrs. Garcia, are you sure you want to do this here, in front of so many people? I smiled at him with genuine affection. Arthur, for 5 years you have been kinder to me than my own son. You have always treated me with respect, no matter how I was dressed or how much money you thought I had. Arthur blushed. You have always been a very elegant lady, Mrs. Garcia, and you always leave the best tips. Tips? Richard looked at me, confused. Arthur replied. Your mother always leaves $100 tips, young man, and she always asks about our families, about our problems. She is the most generous and kind customer we have. Richard opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Clearly, this was another revelation he hadn't expected. That's right, I confirmed. For all these years, while you thought I lived on $200 a week, I was helping employees who needed it, donating to charities and supporting families in need. Jessica murmured. How much money have you donated? In the last 5 years, I replied. I have donated approximately $1 million to various causes, money I could have used to live luxuriously, but which I chose to use to help others. Spontaneous applause erupted from several tables. The diners clearly approved of my philanthropic actions. While you were ashamed of my poverty, I continued, I was using my money to do good. While you excluded me for not being sophisticated enough, I was being more generous than you have ever been. Richard stood up in desperation. Mom, all that is very well, but I am your son. I am your only family. You can't leave all your money to strangers. Strangers? I laughed. Richard, Arthur knows me better than you do. Oscar respects me more than you do. The employees of my restaurants have shown me more affection than you have in the last 5 years. I turned to Mr. Lewis. Sir, please, prepare the documents. I want to sign the new will tonight. No, Richard shouted, trying to approach the table where the documents were. You can't do this. I'm your son. I have rights. Oscar intervened firmly. Young man, please maintain your composure. Mrs. Garcia has every right to dispose of her fortune as she sees fit. This is madness. Jessica began to cry hysterically. Susan, Richard made a mistake, but he doesn't deserve to lose his entire inheritance. I stopped a few steps from the table where the documents were and turned slowly towards Jessica. A mistake? You call 5 years of constant humiliation a mistake? Mr. Lewis placed the documents on the main table where everyone could see. Mrs. Garcia, before proceeding, I must ask, are you completely sure of this decision? Once signed, these documents will be legally binding. Sir, I replied in a firm voice, I have never been more sure of anything in my life. Richard ran towards the table, but Oscar and 2 waiters stopped him gently but firmly. Mom, wait, give me a chance to explain. Give me a chance to change. A chance? I turned to him in disbelief. Richard, you've had 5 years of chances. Every time you excluded me from an event, it was a lost chance. Every time you were ashamed of me, it was a lost chance. Jessica stood up, swaying slightly. Susan, please, think about this rationally. If you take away Richard's inheritance, you're also punishing your future grandchildren. A sad smile crossed my face. My future grandchildren? Jessica, you've been married for 3 years. How many times have you included me in conversations about having children? How many times have you made me feel like I would be a welcome grandmother? Jessica couldn't answer. The truth is, I continued, you don't want me to be a part of your future children's lives. You don't want a poor, uneducated grandmother influencing the upbringing of your successful children. A murmur of understanding was heard throughout the restaurant. The diners could clearly see the logic in my words. Mr. Lewis opened the document folder. Mrs. Garcia, here are the new documents. The will divides your fortune between 5 charitable organizations and 10 employees of your restaurants who have shown exceptional loyalty. Richard tried to approach again, but this time his voice was pleading. Mom, please, at least leave me a small part. Not everything, but something. A chance to prove to you that I can change. I paused with the pen in my hand. A small part? So you can continue to live comfortably without learning anything from this experience? No, Richard protested, so I can prove that I've learned my lesson, so I can earn you back. Jessica approached me with tears in her eyes. Susan, give him a chance. Set conditions. Make him earn your forgiveness. I looked at my son, who stood there with red eyes and a broken face. For the first time in years, I saw real vulnerability in him, not the superficial arrogance he had shown for so long. Conditions? I repeated slowly. What kind of conditions? Richard lit up with hope. Whatever you want, Mom. Anything. I'll do whatever it takes. Mr. Lewis looked at me questioningly. Mrs. Garcia, would you like us to explore that option? We can create a conditional will. I walked slowly around the table, considering the possibilities. The entire restaurant was in complete silence, waiting for my decision. Very well, I said finally. If you really want a chance, Richard, here are my conditions. Richard nodded desperately. Yes, anything. First condition, I announced clearly so the whole restaurant could hear. For the next year, you and Jessica will volunteer at a nursing home. Every weekend. Without exception, Jessica opened her mouth to protest, but Richard stopped her. I accept. What else? Second condition, you will move out of your big house and live on a budget of $1,500 a month. The same budget you thought I had. Richard paled. But Mom, my mortgage, my expenses. What, Richard? You can't live on the budget you considered adequate for your mother? The comment drew some nervous laughter from the nearby tables. Third condition, I continued. You will work part-time in one of my restaurants, as a waiter. You will experience what it's like to serve others, to treat people from all social classes with respect. As a waiter? Jessica asked in horror. But Richard is an executive. Exactly, I replied. And it's time he learned some humility. Richard took a deep breath. I accept. Is there more? Fourth condition, you will write public letters of apology. One letter to the local newspaper apologizing for your behavior towards the elderly. One letter to your company, taking responsibility for your lack of family values. The color completely drained from Richard's face. Mom, that would ruin my career. Your career? I laughed. Richard, after what happened here tonight, your career is already ruined. This will at least give you a chance to save it with dignity. Mr. Martinez, Richard's colleague, stood up. Excuse me, Mrs. Garcia, but I must tell you that the company is already considering suspending Richard. His behavior tonight goes against all of our corporate values. Richard turned to him in desperation. Mr. Martinez, please? I'm sorry, Richard, Mr. Martinez replied firmly. Our company values family respect and personal integrity. What we have seen here tonight is unacceptable. I turned back to Richard. You see, your career is already in jeopardy. My conditions would at least give you a way to redeem yourself. And the fifth condition? Richard asked, his voice breaking. The fifth condition is the most important, I said solemnly. For 1 full year, you and Jessica will visit me every week. Not because I have money, but because I am your mother. You will spend time with me. You will really get to know me. You will learn who I am as a person. Jessica muttered. That doesn't sound so hard, doesn't it? I turned to her. Jessica, when was the last time you had a real conversation with me? A conversation where you asked me about my dreams, my fears, my life experiences? Jessica couldn't answer. And do you know what the sixth condition is? I added. Sixth? Richard asked nervously. If during this 1-year trial you fail to meet any of these conditions, or if you show that you are only acting for the money, the original will is automatically activated. All the money will go to charity. Mr. Lewis nodded. That is perfectly legal, Mrs. Garcia. We can create a conditional will with those specifications. Richard looked at Jessica, who reluctantly nodded. I accept all the conditions, Mom. I completely accept them. Good, I said, picking up the pen. But there's one more thing I need to say before I sign any document. The whole restaurant held its breath. What happened here tonight cannot be undone. The words you said, the humiliation you caused me, the pain you made me feel that is now a part of our history." Richard nodded, with tears in his eyes. "I know, Mom. I know, and I'm so sorry." "Don't tell me you're sorry," I replied firmly. "Show me. Show me over the next year that you have truly learned something from this experience." I turned to Mr. Lewis. "Sir, prepare the conditional will, with all the conditions I have mentioned." "Of course, Mrs. Garcia," he replied, beginning to write. While the lawyer prepared the documents, I addressed the entire restaurant one more time. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have witnessed a very important lesson tonight. You have seen what happens when people value money more than respect, when they confuse material success with human worth." Applause started at one table and spread throughout the restaurant. It was applause of approval, of respect, of admiration for the way I had handled the situation. "I hope," I continued, "that you all remember this night when you interact with your own families. I hope you remember that respect and love do not have an admission price." The applause grew louder. Some people stood up, giving me an ovation. Richard approached me timidly. "Mom, can I hug you?" I looked at him for a long moment. "Richard, hugs are something that are earned. Over the next year, you are going to have to earn every hug, every smile, every moment of affection." He nodded, finally understanding the magnitude of what he had lost. 6 months after that night, that changed everything. I was sitting at the same table in the Gilded Scepter restaurant, but this time the atmosphere was completely different. There was no tension, no shouting, no humiliation. There was only a 65-year-old woman watching her son work as a waiter in her own restaurant. Richard approached my table with a tray in his hands, wearing the black uniform of the restaurant. His face no longer showed arrogance or shame. There was something new in his eyes, genuine humility. "Good evening, Mrs. Garcia," he said with a smile that seemed real for the first time in years. "What would you like to order tonight?" I smiled, but maintained my composure. "Richard, how was your day?" "Difficult," he admitted, sitting in the chair across from me when I gestured. A customer yelled at me because his soup was too hot. Another complained because I took 30 seconds to bring him water. And a lady treated me as if I were invisible. "And how did that make you feel?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Richard looked down, horrible, humiliated, like I wasn't a whole person. He looked up at me. "Is that how I made you feel for so many years?" It was the first time in months that he had directly admitted the parallel between his current experience and how he had treated me. It was progress. "And Jessica?" I asked. "How is she handling the changes?" "Better than I expected," Richard answered honestly. "At first, she complained a lot about the small apartment, the limited budget, the volunteer work at the nursing home. But something changed a few weeks ago." "What changed?" "She met an 80-year-old woman named Teresa. Her children abandoned her 5 years ago. She hasn't received a single visit in all that time." Richard paused, his eyes watering slightly. Jessica realized that woman was exactly what you would have become if I had continued on the same path. I felt a warmth in my chest. It was the first time I had heard that Jessica had made a real emotional connection with the situation. "Teresa told Jessica how her children only visited when they needed money," Richard continued. "How they would promise to come for dinner, but always had last-minute excuses. How she felt invisible in her own family. And it affected her. Jessica cried all night after that conversation. She told me she finally understood why you had done what you did. She told me that we were turning you into Teresa." Oscar discreetly approached our table. "Mrs. Garcia, forgive the interruption. Mr. Richard has been an excellent employee. He always arrives early, treats everyone with respect, and customers comment positively on his service." Richard blushed slightly at the praise. "Thank you, Oscar. I'm learning a lot." After Oscar walked away, I looked at my son carefully. "Richard, can I ask you something honestly?" "Of course, Mom. Are you doing all this just for the money? Just for the inheritance?" Richard was silent for a long moment. It was a question I had been waiting for the right time to ask. At first, he finally admitted, "Yes." The first few weeks, every action I took was calculated. Every word I said was to impress you. I was acting to get my inheritance back. His honesty surprised me. "But?" I asked, sensing there was more. But something changed when I started working here, when I started really interacting with people from different social classes, when I started to see how the employees spoke of you with such affection and respect. Richard paused. I realized that for years I had been living in a bubble of arrogance. He leaned forward, his voice becoming more intense. Mom, I really got to know Arthur for the first time. Did you know he has 3 children and is paying for his oldest daughter's college by working here? Did you know that you secretly paid for his gallbladder surgery last year? I smiled softly. Arthur is a good man, and I treated him as if he were invisible. I treated him as if he were just a waiter. But he's a hard-working father. He's a noble man. He's someone who deserves respect. Richard ran his hands through his hair. How could I have been so blind? And what about your career? I asked. Do you regret losing your executive position? Richard laughed, but it wasn't a bitter laugh. You know what? No. And that surprises even me. Why not? Because I realized my success was built on false values. I realized I was so obsessed with impressing others that I lost sight of who I really was. At that moment, Jessica entered the restaurant. She was no longer wearing expensive dresses or ostentatious jewelry. She wore simple but elegant clothes, and there was something different in her posture. She seemed more authentic. Hello, Susan, she greeted me, and for the first time in years, her greeting sounded genuine. How are you? I'm well. Jessica, how was the nursing home today? Emotional, she replied, sitting next to Richard. Teresa taught me how to knit, and she told me stories about her youth during the war. It's incredible the wisdom these people have. I saw Richard look at her with admiration. It was clear that these changes in Jessica had also strengthened their relationship. Susan, Jessica continued, I want to apologize, not just for that night at the restaurant, but for years of terrible behavior. What do you mean specifically? I asked. I needed to know that she understood exactly what she had done wrong. I mean all the times I excluded you from our lives because I thought you weren't sophisticated enough. I mean all the times I influenced Richard to be ashamed of you. I mean having judged your worth as a person based solely on your financial appearance. Her words sounded sincere. And now that you know I have money, how do you feel about it? Honestly, Jessica smiled sadly. I feel like an idiot. All these months working with the elderly, I've met so many extraordinary people who live with very little money but have immense emotional riches. Richard nodded. Mom, we've learned that real wealth has nothing to do with the money in the bank. I took an envelope from my purse and placed it on the table. Richard and Jessica looked at it with curiosity and some nervousness. What is that? Richard asked. It's an evaluation, I replied. For these 6 months, I have been observing, asking, investigating. I have spoken with your supervisors at the nursing home, with your colleagues here at the restaurant, with your neighbors in the small apartment. Jessica turned pale. An evaluation of what? Of whether your changes are genuine or if you are just acting for the money. I opened the envelope and took out several papers. Here is the report from the nursing home supervisor. It says that you not only meet your required hours, but you often stay extra time. It says you have connected emotionally with the residents. Richard and Jessica exchanged hopeful glances. Here is Oscar's report on Richard's performance as a waiter. It says he is respectful, hard-working, and that he genuinely cares about the customer's experience. I continued reading. And here are the observations from your neighbors about how you live now. They say you are humble, that you help other residents, that you don't complain about your reduced circumstances. And what is your conclusion? Jessica asked, her voice trembling. I put the papers back in the envelope and looked them straight in the eye. My conclusion is that you have learned your lesson. Not completely, because 6 months don't erase 5 years of problematic behavior, but you have shown that change is possible. Richard began to smile hopefully. Does that mean? It means, I said solemnly, that we are going to continue with this process, but with modifications. What kind of modifications? Jessica asked. First, Richard will continue to work at the restaurant, but now he will receive a fair salary and will have the opportunity to learn the business from the ground up. If he shows real ability and dedication, he could eventually have a role in management. Richard nodded enthusiastically. Second, you will move to a larger apartment, but you will not return to your previous lifestyle. You will live comfortably, but modestly. And third, I continued, we are going to start spending time together as a family. Real time, not an act. We are going to get to know each other as people. Jessica began to cry, but these were tears of relief and gratitude. Thank you, Susan. Thank you for giving us this chance. Don't thank me yet, I said firmly. This is just the beginning. You have to keep proving that these changes are permanent. Richard took my hand. Mom, I want you to know something. Even if you decide not to leave me any money, these months have been the most valuable of my life. I have learned who I really want to be. For the first time in years, I allowed the tears to flow freely down my cheeks. You know what, Richard? That's the only thing I ever wanted to hear you say. I stood up and looked around the restaurant where everything had changed 6 months ago. Tonight, when those cruel words came out of your mouth, I thought I had lost my son forever. But now I see that I didn't lose him. He was just hidden under layers of arrogance and false values. Richard stood up too and looked me in the eye. Mom, can I hug you now? I smiled, remembering my words from that night, that hugs were something to be earned. Yes, son, you've earned this hug. When Richard hugged me, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. The unconditional love of a son who finally understood his mother's worth. Not for her money, not for what she could give him, but for who she was as a person. Jessica joined the hug, and for the first time in a long time, I truly felt like I had a family. As we separated, I looked towards the restaurant tables. Some of the diners who had witnessed that terrible night were there again, and several smiled and nodded at me in approval. You know what's the most ironic thing about all this? I said to Richard. What? That by losing your arrogance and your obsession with money, you have finally become someone worthy of inheriting a fortune. Richard smiled, but it was a different smile. It was the smile of someone who had found something more valuable than money. He had found his humanity. And I, Susan Garcia, had found something I thought I had lost forever. I had found my son. Real wealth, after all, is not measured in dollars. It is measured in respect, in genuine love, and in the ability to see the value in every person, regardless of what they have or don't have. That night, as we left the restaurant together as a real family for the first time in years, I knew I had made the right decision. Sometimes, to save someone you love, you first have to be willing to lose them. And sometimes, the greatest wealth you can leave your children is not money, but the lesson of how to be a good person.